I guess you could say I always wanted to be close to animals. Always had my hands and feet in poop, any way you want to describe it. My mother was the brownie leader for my older sister known as Troop. On one occasion, when I was about 6 years old, my mother was escorting two brownie troops to a park at a beautiful duck pond. Had to be more duck poop than actual water. It was just one of those places where kids could go and feed the ducks. I guess I must have just watched Davy Crockett on television because my parents had bought me the entire King of the Wild Frontier outfit. Let me tell you, when you put on the Davy Crockett outfit, you're not the same person. I don't care who you are, after you put on that coonskin hat, you're someone else. I became the mountaineer that Davy Crockett was. And I was pretty cool, too. Going to a park with all the cute brownies, I was all dressed up and wanted to impress the girls by showing them how to feed the ducks and get the ducks to come to them. Well, while I was feeding the ducks, I slipped on some duck shit. Yes, duck shit. And yes, little Warren Crockett fell into the duck pond. I was covered from head to toe with duck poop. I stunk. Painfully to this day, I can still visualize it. I was beet red walking out of the pond with my coonskin cap, my pants with the fringes on the sides, and matching fringe shirt covered with duck poop. That was probably one of the most embarrassing moments of my life. Though I was born in the wilds of the Bronx, I had a natural love for animals. I was an ugly kid and very shy. Our first home was in a veterans housing project in a rough section of Rockaway Beach, New York. When I was 6 years old, I was nearly burned at the stake by a gang of neighborhood toughs. They actually tied me to a tree in the swamps, put brush around the tree by my feet, and set it afire. Luckily, my friend Richie ran and got help, and other than a few singed hairs, I survived. To this day, I don't know why it happened. You know, when I was in third grade, our family realized the 1950s dream and moved to a home in a suburb of New York called Oceanside, to a glamorous sounding name street, Bayside Avenue. I grew up in a religiously mixed neighborhood whose households were economically diverse. There were the very poor called clam diggers, the hardcore blue-collar workers, and the upper middle class whose fathers were lawyers and businessmen, many of whom were in the garment business. Many of the Jewish kids I knew were in the upper middle class families. I was not necessarily accepted easily. So most of my friends were very blue collar, and I was the only Jew hanging out with them, all Italian and Irish kids. I took a lot of ribbing for being Jewish, so at an early age, after many beatings, I learned how to take care of myself. Not that my father encouraged it, but he was my hero and never took any crap from anybody. I believed real men had to be tough, and while I was not much of a reader, I devoured everything I could on Wild Bill Hickok, Kit Carson, and of course, Wyatt Earp. Our house was located on a bird sanctuary called Powell Creek, actually owned by the U.S. Army. That creek was a great escape for me. And while in 40 years I never saw any Army people, I did see plenty of mallard ducks, Canada geese, garter snakes, snapping turtles, muskrats, regular rats, and a variety of other critters that my parents were thrilled about me spending my time with. I was one of the proverbial little kids who always brought whatever animals were out there into the house. And it didn't matter to me whether it was a field mouse, a lizard, a snake. One day I brought a rat home, and my mother and father looked at me and with the eyes rolling back said, "What are you going to do with that rat?" I swore to them, "Mom and Dad, you don't understand. This only looks like a rat. Only looks like a rat. It's really one of those adorable little muskrats. Something is wrong with it. It's lost its hair." And my mother and father just looked at each other, well, you know that look, and knew that saying no at this point was useless. So I kept him and named him Chas, C-H-A-S, after my father, who signed his name that way. Usually his name was Charlie. Naming a rat after your father, I guess my father didn't appreciate that too much, but I still kept the rat. I kept Chas for about 4 or 5 months. Rats are incredibly smart animals. They make super pets, and I'm on the bandwagon for them constantly. People, they don't get it. They don't understand how smart they are. But I honestly believe that if rats had hair on their tails, they would be incredibly popular pets. It's just their bald tails that scare people off. Anyway, I remember the rat just kept staying like a rat. Never grew a muskrat coat of hair. My mother, father kept quizzing me, "Warren, how is Chas doing? When is he going to grow his hair back?" When are you going to release him back? Ultimately, yes, ultimately, I had to release him, but I did have them convinced for a good 6 months that I had a bald muskrat when it was nothing more than an average good old-fashioned backyard hang-around rat. I let Chas loose, but interestingly enough, the rat maintained a relationship with me. I used to hang out by a drainage ditch behind the house, and for months after I released him, Chas would be there in the afternoon when I came home from school. Then one day, he disappeared. Somehow, Chas and I bonded and have incredibly fond memories of him to this day. My father bought an auto body shop in Farmingdale, Long Island. It was called McLean's Auto Body. He never bothered to change the shop's name, so my father, a Jewish guy, owned a body shop with an Irish name. And people wonder why I travel to the beat of a different drum. You know, as soon as the shop opened, I decided that he needed a guard dog. I accompanied my father to the local pound where he looked at German Shepherds and Dobermans. But I talked him into a mournful-looking 100-pound St. Bernard. He had such sad eyes, and I immediately called him Charlie, my father's name. How could he say no? Where are we going to keep the dog? I asked my father when we got back to the shop. In my office, he replied. I protested, Dad, the office is way too small. We're going to need to build Charlie a doghouse. Well, the doghouse turned out to be quite a project. In fact, it was closer in size to a garage than any little doghouse I've ever seen. In the days ahead, this is where I would spend my time sanding cars and falling asleep with Charlie. You know, I recall driving home the first night and my father bragging, Warren, no one would dare break into the shop with good old Charlie around. Boy, was he in for a surprise. The next morning, one of the employees called from the payphone next to the shop. My dad asked, what the hell's the commotion, Gus? We can't open the shop because this damn dog won't let us in, Gus muttered. Charlie turned out to be the perfect watchdog. He watched everyone, but the only people he would bark at were the people who worked there. You know, Charlie was the first in a succession of junkyard dogs that I would turn into lap dogs. Needless to say, my dad's shop was robbed regularly, usually with a note that read, what a nice dog. You know, we were so naive that when we decided to get our first at-home dog, my father took me, to Macy's. Yes, Macy's had a pet department, and they sold dogs. What did we know back then? We could not make up our minds whether we wanted a collie or a German Shepherd. It was called the Lassie or Rin Tin Tin syndrome in those days. You know, I always felt Rin Tin Tin was more macho, even though he was a she, pretty risque for those days. My German Shepherd, which I named Smoki, became my first best friend. In fact, I still have her first collar. It was also at this time that I would start to spend my entire afternoons with the wildlife in my backyard. An afternoon with snapping turtles was much less stressful than an afternoon in the house. If you grew up in my family, you would probably feel as compatible with the animals as I did. You've heard the story of the relative who came to the bar mitzvah and never left. Along with my new child at home, in this suburban oasis, came wall-to-wall relatives. Not only did my mother keep setting an ever-expanding table, but entire new wings of the house kept popping up. You know, the house was always full of people, relatives, friends, constantly coming and staying. When I was in the 5th grade, the first relative to join us was my cousin Joanne, who came to live with us after both of her parents passed away. When I was a teenager, my mother's parents, Louie and Molly Weiss, retired from the Bronx to their retirement villa on Oceanside's Bayside Avenue. Then after my father's mother passed away, Warren Eckstein joined us. Since Papa Louie was a double amputee, our split-level ranch had to be made wheelchair accessible, so my parents took the dining room and cut it in half and enclosed it as a bedroom and a bathroom. My maternal grandparents had immigrated from Romania and Austria, so the language difference resulted in my new name, Vaden. That's right, Vaden. I would spend hours on end listening to Grandma Molly tell stories of her childhood in Romania. I guess that's where I get a little bit of my gypsy instincts. The one that has always stuck out in my mind was the harrowing tale of the white horse. Here's how my grandmother told it. Warren, it was a rainy early morning in the little town of Falticini, Romania, where Grandma grew up. Just before dawn, Molly would normally be rubbing the sleep from her eyes, but before starting that long list of chores at the family's farm. Suddenly, she heard screams in the distance, then horses' hooves pounding the dirt, galloping closer and closer and closer. A kaleidoscope of terror began to unfold. Yes, it was a band of Nazi sympathizers raiding and ravaging the gentle way of life that Molly and generations before her had revered. The band's speed and stealthiness had enabled them to attack and rape the town's women after swiftly killing the men, including my great-grandfather. It was a horrific experience for a 12-year-old to comprehend. As they sought Molly next, she ran out to the barn, where her family had a white horse. In her own broken words, this was the most incredible horse that ever lived. The horse maneuvered itself between young Molly and these anti-Semite bastards. And when they tried to accost her, the horse reared up and kicked, giving her the opportunity to run and hide, which ultimately saved my grandma's life. I must have heard this story 1,000 times growing up. My grandma Molly suffered a stroke at 72, and it was so heartbreaking watching her try to fight back. I remember sitting with her one day and asking her again about this white horse that saved her life. It brought a smile to her face, the only response she could give. My grandma Molly died shortly after that. But the story of the white horse, is in my heart forever. Maybe, just maybe, it's partially the horse saving my grandma's life that made me devote my entire life to helping as many animals as I possibly could. The Bickersons. My family's way of talking to one another was to bicker. Not that there was anything wrong with that. All it would take to start an argument in my house was for my father to say he liked the Brooklyn Dodgers. My grandfather would immediately taunt them by saying that the New York Giants were a much, much better team. Even the strength of the morning coffee could trigger bickering. I remember my father saying to my grandfather, "I could pee darker than that coffee." With over 325 years of life spanning the various family members, it was inevitable that there would be just as many different ways of looking at things. They all loved each other. The bickering was simply their way of communicating. I recall how my grandfathers would argue every weekend as to which was a better car, a Pontiac or a Chevrolet. The wars over which television show to watch were legendary, and there was always a scramble for the best seat in the house. Privacy was out of the question, just bringing up any normal family problem, and pow, everyone became involved, jumping in with a different opinion, and it went round and round that way for hours. It was this constant stress that drove me to escape by spending my time with the animals. Of course, I had human friends, but I always felt more at home with the animals. They didn't care if my nails were dirty or if I got a D on my report card, and there were a lot of those. I tried to tell the disappointed family clan that the animals didn't care. Why should they? I guess they just didn't get it. Time moves on, and so did I. I went on to high school, which was one of my most difficult times. I was shy, bored, and rebellious. What a combination. I was always in trouble. I think my mom spent more time at my school than I did. It was at this point that I began to realize that my mind was more comfortable with abstract thoughts than with black and white statistics. My parents and teachers thought I was lazy and lacked focus, but I knew I was just looking for a direction. They even sent me to the school psychologist, who agreed with many of my teachers. I would never amount to anything unless I did it their way. But I was rebellious, and this was just one more reason to rebel. Smokin. As I've said, ours was not a tranquil household, and I grew up banging on the table with knives and forks while my father constantly yelled at me. Someone suggested drum lessons, which I think became my way of letting out my frustration. I'm not a very assertive person with a tendency to keep a lot inside. Maybe playing the drums was my way of banging it out. As shy as I was, I just loved being in front of a crowd playing the drums, sitting in with local bands for high school dances and parties. One of the bands I was involved with was a group called, yes, the Long Island Sounds. Not proud of that name. What an incredible name I thought back then. The band consisted of lead, rhythm guitar, bass guitar, and organ, and of course drums and a lead singer. We were all in D Malay, which by the way was a younger version of the Masonic Temple at this point, so we played for a lot of their functions. Wayne, the lead singer of the group, and I never got along. He had dropped out of high school, really thought of himself as a tough guy, and used to be the bully of the group of kids we hung around with. The day I met him, we were at a softball game, and Wayne challenged me, "Let's wrestle." I've been wrestling my entire life since I was a kid, watching it on TV all the time, when Rocco and Bruno Sammartino were in the ring. So we wrestled, and when I pinned him down, he split his pants. He was really upset and was always tense after that. Wayne's mother worked for RCA Records and actually arranged for the group to do an audition tape for their label. The next day, I'm sure there was no response that quickly from RCA, Wayne blurted out, they loved the band, except they think the drummer really sucked. I think that was the last time I spoke to him, and we were later officially turned down. I did have some friends who played in the fire department band, however, for the Oceanside Volunteer Fire Department. That really appealed to me because, as a band member, you can go to the parades and the drills and hang out with the fire guys. We'd march, then go on to the block parties afterward. I really did it, and it gave me a sense of belonging. Back then, it was very unusual for a Jew to be in the fire department. Out of maybe 300 members, there weren't more than 2 or 3. Now, in my adolescent struggle to being recognized, I was a member of an organization. Fire guys were respected. They were considered tough, drinking, macho-type guys who would go in and fight fires. Even though it was volunteer department, I loved to hang out at the firehouse, sneaking a beer now and then, keeping up with the older guys. You know, the day I turned 18, while still in high school, I became an active member of the Volunteer Fire Department Rescue Squad No. 1 in Oceanside, Long Island. It also gave me the opportunity to wear a uniform and carry a badge, which I've been looking forward to for months. Back then, the mascot of Rescue 1 was Donald Duck. I had a decal on the side of my car with Donald Duck in a fireman's hat carrying a first aid kit going off to rescue someone. You know, once I joined, I found out there was a lot more involved than just standing there holding a hose. At fire school, I learned all the types of advanced first aid, taking the first emergency medical technician course ever given on Long Island. In fact, I still have the card. I would love to sit here and say that what motivated me was my passion to save people, but I think it was more the camaraderie. I always had a fear of being white collar, and this gave me the chance to hang out with the blue collar guys and have a beer on a Sunday morning while they washed the fire trucks. I also enjoyed the fact that they loved animals. You know, as an ambulance technician, I was also the designated driver. Our calls ranged from decapitations at the scene of a car accident to heart attacks and broken bones. I lived in the town my entire life, and many of the people I came in contact with were people I knew from local hardware store or the neighborhood candy store. So it was fascinating. I felt good about what I was doing, but there were also times when it was way too personal. I remember one time being dispatched to a car accident in front of Nathan's. Not the Nathan's famous in Coney Island, but a second one they opened up in Oceanside. It was late at night, and the victim was someone I had known all through my school years, from grade school to high school graduation. It was a really severe accident, and he was partially decapitated. The rest of his body was mangled in a mass of twisted metal. It was one of the toughest calls I'd ever have gone on. You know, part of our job was to rescue firemen in the event of injury, so we'd be the first ones behind them during a fire, to help any firefighter who needed to be rescued. And in many fire scenes, I had arguments with the guys because after we'd gone in on a search and not found anyone, I plead, wait, let's go back in and bring out the fish or the bird or the cat or the dog or the gerbil or the hamster. You know, it only takes a little smoke to hurt a parrot. They would shake their heads and mutter, you're crazy. But I would go back into the fire because to me, the animals were living things and it was equally important to get them out. I remember, for example, my friend Joe Chelik, who has since passed away, who was also a lover of cats and dogs. At the scene of the fire, we found a dog that had been burned and had stopped breathing. I cradled it in my arms, and we raced it to a local veterinarian hospital with Joe driving, the siren going, and me giving mouth-to-snout resuscitation. Taking an ambulance from the scene of a fire and going to an animal hospital, let's just say the department wasn't too thrilled about it. You know, rescuing animals was just something I did instinctively. And on several occasions, I was on the receiving end of a good talking to by the chief for using an oxygen mask on a dog or pumping some oxygen into the water of a fish tank. It was kind of a running joke at the firehouse. Anytime anything involved animals, it was, let's get Warren involved. You know, the animals usually recovered well on these occasions, so who cares about a little reprimand every now and then? I mean, these were just things that I would do. And the interesting part about it is that I would start seeing the other guys in the volunteer fire department taking an interest in what I was doing and what an incredible group of guys they were. And while they loved to party, they knew what they were there for. They did the job they had to do. And let me tell you, it was a very dangerous one they were doing. I broke my shoulder one time by falling off the back of a fire truck. One perilous incident took place when I was the first fireman at the scene of a fire. Because it was a volunteer fire department, in the event of an actual fire, we had the option of going to the firehouse and hopping on a truck, or using the flashing blue lights on our cars and going directly to the scene of the accident, fire, or whatever the emergency might be. Anyway, I went in having what they call a Scott pack or an air pack on my back, and I started checking around to make sure no one was at that location. I remained getting in these until I was totally disoriented. I got really woozy. I started crawling around. I was disoriented and lost. I had no idea which way to go. The smoke kept rolling in, thick and black. I just kept crawling around, lost. I knew I was going to die. I thought, this is it. Then all of a sudden, I saw a little ray of light and stuck my finger there. My friend and fellow fireman Joe Chellick swooped in, pulled me out, gave me oxygen, and rushed me over to South Nassau Community Hospital. I believe I spent a week with severe smoke inhalation and some other problems. Perhaps if I hadn't ended up working with animals, I would have ultimately chosen some type of fire or rescue work. The firehouse was a real man's place. Every Sunday afternoon, there was a poker game going on. I actually remember seeing a man lose the deed to his house at a poker game at the fire station. The men were a fascinating collection of human beings. As volunteers, there were no class distinctions. We even had guys who worked at the fire department in New York City as paid firemen and did the volunteer thing during their free time. There were guys who were always getting into fist fights, always cheating on this one was cheating with that one, back and forth and back and forth. The majority of them were in their 30s, blue-collar workers, and very patriotic. A lot of them were veterans of the Korean War or were back from serving their time in Vietnam. Even those who hadn't been in the military had a tendency to be very patriotic. At the time, my hair was relatively long, and they would always make fun of me at the firehouse, calling me a hippie bastard, pinko commie, all those things. They were joking with me, but it was also the way they thought. I remember going to parades with the volunteer fire department and getting into fights because some guys would say something about the long hairs and the long hairs would respond. It was like something out of a B movie. But it did give me the opportunity to learn how to adapt. Everything in life, I believe, teaches you something. My firefighting days taught me how to adapt to whatever person I may be with at a given time. This was particularly helpful later on when I went into the military and had to live in close quarters with a lot of different personalities. It was a fascinating time in my life. I look back now with a tremendous amount of pride that I was able to be a volunteer for over 5 years. Some of these guys are still volunteering. I see them walking around town and say hello whenever I can. They risk their lives every single day for us without being paid a dime. But that's what their life is all about. Living in town, being part of it, and giving back when they can. They are the most incredible group of men I've ever met in my life, and they deserve, yes, they deserve a lot more thanks than they get. Student activist. By the skin of my teeth, I managed to graduate from high school with the rest of the class of 1967. I despised those years. There wasn't one classmate who I considered a real close friend or a teacher I could connect with. And here I was at a crossroads. I had to make a very major decision in my life. The majority of my classmates were doing everything they could to get their student deferments to avoid the draft, attending the most obscure colleges higher learning had to offer. Paradoxically, I had a very patriotic feeling at this stage of my life. Yet, there was a conflicting sense of duty to my parents, who had both made a lot of sacrifices so that I could break out of the blue-collar confines that limited their dreams. I really didn't know what to do. My mother persisted with comments like, of course, you want to go to college and be a doctor. What else from a Jewish mom? However, getting into college at this point, we're talking 1966, 67, was no easy task. Literally, everybody and their brother was trying to keep from going into the military. And because I had done so poorly in high school, colleges were not exactly waving their pennants at me. But I tested well on the SAT exams and had a guidance counselor who took a liking to me and saw potential. I'll never forget her name, Elaine Rapp. She saw something, or maybe saw past something, in my aptitude. And by speaking with my mother, they located 3 colleges that would accept me. One, I believe, was in Boone, Iowa. Another was down in the Ozarks somewhere. And the third was Ricker College in Holton, Maine. Ricker was a Presbyterian college, and I think the total student population was approximately 1,000, give or take. I took a short scenic ride through, and it was a very pretty campus. It was way up in northern Maine, the oldest community in a rustic county dating back to 1805. I remember driving into the town the first time and seeing the war memorial in the center of town. It was a large potato. You see, Houghton is a farming county, and potatoes are the major crop. Academic life at Ricker College was curious to me, since some of the students at the college were in their 30s, and here I was 18 years old. Except for me, of course, and my potential, every loser in the world was attending Ricker College. Interestingly enough, many years later, just on a goof as I was driving around Mars Hill Mountain, Houghton ski area, I went back to Ricker College and I found a no trespassing sign nailed up. The school had closed, I believe, 2 years after I left. So here I was hating this place. Everyone was partying, doing some type of drug or drinking Colt 45, a local beverage of choice. I regularly got into fistfights. In fact, one which resulted in my spending 3 days in jail after a confrontation with a campus police officer who had made a derogatory remark to a friend of mine. Anyway, I was thrown in a cell with some Native American migrant workers who were there doing some potato picking. My mother had to scrape together $1,200 or $1,300, and I went on all kinds of double secret probation, like in the movie Animal House. At the school, I would come home as many weekends as I could, faking everything from mononucleosis to tonsillitis, trying to get into another school. I used any excuse to get my parents to send me money to fly home on weekends. Or I'd hitch home, whatever I had to do. Ricker College didn't allow first-year students to have a car on campus. I never understood that rule. I tried to ground myself by spending lots of time in the outlying acreage, being most incredible woodland area of America. While hiking and walking, I spotted bears and moose, white-tailed deer, raccoons, possum, and just an incredible array of wildlife. Remember, this was the late 60s. There I'd been, communing with nature, enjoying being around the animals. As a matter of fact, I stuck up a friendship with a girl in Maine whose father managed a kennel, and we would go over there sometimes, and I'd just hang out with the dogs. I even did some dog training back then to keep my sanity. Surprisingly, even though I was partying, I did get a substantially good grade. And at that school, because I was learning things that I had the desire to learn. They were getting into biology, psychology, sociology, things I applied myself to learn, whereas in high school, I had no yearning to learn what a logarithm was. So because my marks were good, my mother, through a friend of a friend of a friend at Long Island University, was able to get me a transfer to CW Post, the LIU campus in Greenvale, which I meant would be a moving back to home. Yeah, it did mean moving back to home. I don't know which was worse, Ricker College or living at home with my mother and father. They were great people who just made me crazy. Anyway, I moved back to Long Island and went to CW Post College, where I pursued my psychology studies. Yet, interestingly enough, at that time, I spent every moment I had working at local veterinary hospitals, humane societies. Anyone would give me the opportunity to be around animals. I remember I had a friend who worked down at the racetrack where I'd go just to be around the horses. I even hung out at the local pet stores. My fascination was a driving force. I knew somewhere in the back of my head, animals. I appreciated them for what they were, but didn't know where it was going to take me in terms of a career. While attending CW Post, I was taking some advanced psychology classes. I remember them doing some research. I believe the research had to do with some hallucinatory drugs on rats to see what type of reaction they had for some psychological reason. Looking back on it, and having been involved with a lot of humane movements over the years, it was probably just the way at the time to get some type of government funding or grant money to do research that was probably redundant and abusive to animals, which it turned out to be. I remember getting up in class and arguing with the professor by saying, listen, why should we inflict a drug of choice on animals? In other words, these hallucinatory drugs like mescaline are not used medically. They're used primarily by people who want to get high. Why should we subject mice, rats, or any other animal to the abuse of pain of a drug that we choose to do? I mean, they all have mothers and fathers, and they all have hearts. To me, the reasoning behind their research sounded absolutely ludicrous. And yet they went ahead. The fact that this experimentation and research was taking place triggered me to temporarily leave CW Post College. And this was not the only place that I had heard about this. Now I started getting involved with the humane movement, gathering more and more information on the amount of animal abuse actually going on in this country. In terms of animal research, I don't want to sound like an abolitionist here, but listen to me. The bottom line is going back to those early days of the 70s. It was very, very sadistic. C.W. Bell's College had an equestrian stable with horseback riding, which was the old summer home of Marjorie Post of the Post cereal family, located on the North Shore of Long Island. And it was a very exclusive place. Anyway, now I was becoming a student activist, involved with humane activities and different animal rights groups, which were very splintered back then. I observed that there were issues that needed to be dealt with. While it was true the horses were all treated incredibly well, it was disturbing to see large colonies of feral cats running around the equestrian center. Outside the humane community, not many people knew we did this, but in the middle of the night, we'd sneak onto the campus, set humane traps called have-a-heart traps, and capture as many of these cats as we possibly could. The purpose was to spay and neuter them and then release them back into the area, figuring they could at least live in a colony without multiplying. I wasn't fond about the cats living outdoors, but I could accept the notion if they were unable to breed. I often wonder what people thought when suddenly the number of cats at the college started diminishing. Did they find out their cats were getting spayed and neutered and wondered how? They were only getting spayed and neutered thanks to one of these mom and pop groups taking responsibility, and I give them a tremendous amount of support for their inspirational activism. Meanwhile, I had a lot of my own problems. I was experimenting with drugs and alcohol. I knew that in my state of mind, if I didn't get away, I'd fall under their devastating influence, as many of my friends had. I remember sitting in a bar the night I decided to enlist, drinking beer and shooters. I was at Vic's Log Cabin, the local hangout for the fire department guys, where I celebrated my first drink. The wall behind the bar was peppered with letters from all over Europe and Southeast Asia, as well as from around the States, written by GIs who had been in the fire department and were now doing their time. I decided that lingering around the oceanside all my life was useless. I had to get away. So it was a combination of patriotism and escapism that made me decide to go into the service. The next morning, I enlisted, prior to telling my parents because I knew they would try everything to talk me out of it. I didn't want to listen, so I enlisted first and told them a day or two later. Off we go into the Wild Blue Yonder. I remember well the morning I left for this service. It was one of those unmistakably hot, humid Long Island days. It was before dawn, and I was walking into the house after being out all night with my friends, kind of a going-away party for me. My mother and father were already up, sitting at the kitchen table, which was the focus room for the family. They had their coffee and their cigarettes, and my mother was teary-eyed, crying the entire time. She still hadn't accepted the fact that I was leaving for the service, since I probably would never have been drafted. Who is crazy enough to enlist in the military with a war going on in Southeast Asia? Were her unspoken words left hanging in the air. She didn't understand the concept that, one, I wanted to get away, and two, I wanted to do my part. She couldn't go with me to the base. She was just too devastated by the whole thing. We got into my father's car, a little red car. I told you my father was in the automobile business, and I'll never forget this car. There was no steering wheel, none. This sounds a little unusual. He was trying this new pulley system where they had these wheels alongside of him. Going to the service in a car with no steering wheel, that's typical of my life. We drove down to the Belt Parkway to Fort Hamilton in Brooklyn, which was the point of no return. This is where people from the New York area left for the military. Once I walked into Fort Hamilton, I knew immediately it was military time because within 5 minutes, they had thrust a broom in my hand and had me sweeping. For the next couple of hours, they put it through some more testing. Then I was on a bus with dozens of other sad sacks headed to JFK Airport to catch a flight to Lackland Air Force Base in beautiful San Antonio, Texas. Arriving on the ground, there was no getting away from it. Everyone started yelling orders at me, and within 8 hours, my hair was shaved off and I was wearing olive drab green. I spent roughly 7 weeks in basic training, learning all the things a good soldier needs to learn. How to march, the military weapons, and just a whole array of things that would serve me later in life. I remember doing drill practice at 6 in the morning while being pelted by hail the size of golf balls. In the afternoon, we tackled the obstacle course where it was so hot we'd had to take salt tablets just to keep going. In fact, I passed out one day and had to be carried off on a stretcher. Leave it to me to choose basic training in August in San Antonio, Texas. While I was there, however, I managed to get over to the Air Police dog kennels and got real friendly with one of the staff. I spent all of my free time working there with him and the dogs until eventually it hit me. This was my calling. This is what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. I entered the service with a bit of an attitude, which got me into a lot of trouble. While I was in basic training, I wasn't really good at taking orders, and I guess that played off my sense of humor. We had an intercom system in the barracks that led downstairs, where our sergeant would be. I remember one time we were all laying in our bunks after lights out. We had done something wrong that day, and he had told us all to get on the floor and give him 50 or 100, whatever number of push-ups he wanted us to do. Now, my assumption was this. He was talking to us from downstairs over the intercom. There's no way he can see us. What are we doing? So why should I bother getting down on the floor and doing his push-ups? We're going to lie in bed and just go, 1, sir, 2, sir, 3, sir, 4, sir, which is exactly what I did. A few minutes later, I opened my eyes and guess who was standing over me? Stripes alive. It was unmistakably the officer of the day. I pulled guard duty for the next 4 hours, the next 4 weeks, the next 6 weeks after that specific episode. I got into a lot of disagreements. First of all, I was Jewish, which was not an easy assignment since there were not a lot of Jewish kids enlisting in the military at that time. And second of all, I was from New York, which a lot of people didn't like either. So it's kind of a learning curve for me in terms of how to adapt and compensate for the fact that people hated me for a variety of reasons. After I made it through basic training, left Lackland Air Force Base and traveled by bus, something ironic about being a bus in the Air Force, to Shepherd Air Force Base near Wichita Falls, Texas, which made my college town of Houghton, Maine look like the hot spot of the world. I did a lot of escaping acts from there. I remember one time hitching with another GI to Oklahoma City to see the rock band Can Heat in concert. Being the rebellious soul I was, I wound up befriending a group of Hells Angels in Oklahoma City. Because of our haircuts, it was obviously we were in the military, and luckily, a lot of these Hells Angels were veterans who kind of took us under their wing. They brought us to a bar in Oklahoma City where the rest of the Angels hung out. It was a scene I'll never forget. We spent 2 days there going AWOL, got back to the base, and ended up in a lot of trouble. While pulling all the extra duty for our escapade, I tried to remember what happened during those 2 days I spent with the Hells Angels. I'm telling you, all I know is that it must have been a lot of fun. From Wichita Falls, I went overseas to my first assignment with the 601st Direct Air Support Squadron in Germany, located just outside of Frankfurt. It was a mobile unit. We both worked and lived out of 2.5-ton trucks because we had to be ready to roll at a moment's notice. Prior to leaving for Germany, though, I had a 30-day leave, so I went back to New York to Oceanside to say goodbye to my family and friends and kind of break up with the girls I was going out with at the time. I just didn't feel it was fair for me to be in the service while they were there by themselves, and it just seemed that having ties at this point was not the right thing to do. I don't know if I did it more for them or for me. Anyway, I did it. It turned out that this mobile outfit afforded me a great deal of freedom. And I spent a lot of TDY, temporary duty, traveling all over the world. Honestly, I can't tell you some of the countries and places I actually had to go to. While in Europe, though, I had access to a Jeep, along with permission to do pretty much whatever I wanted. So I spent virtually all of my time off duty driving around Europe, working mainly with the large training kennels. Had the opportunity to handle an amazing variety of animals while being exposed to some incredible European training techniques, such as Schutzen training, Polizeichen training, Belgian ring sport training. These people were way ahead of us in terms of their approaches to training animals. Their techniques taught dogs to be very obedient against all types of obstacles. Traveling up the Main and Rhine rivers, I was introduced to some of the European breeds that I would never have gotten to work with had I stayed in the States. Incredible dogs like the Leonberg, which, by the way, I thought was a Jewish accountant when I first heard the name. There was the Bouvier des Flanders. I got down on my hands and knees with giant Schnauzers, Dobermans, Great Danes, German Shepherds, an amazing breed called a Haverwort, as well as Rottweilers in the actual town of Rottweil, Germany. During my time in Europe, I was introduced to many trainers and behaviorists from universities and traveling circuses where I began to work with primates and large cats. There was much to learn from these trainers, and we used to engage in some very heated discussions at the local guest house, the U.S. equivalent of our local tavern. over much Steinhager and beer, believe me. I felt that many of the techniques were a little too strong and convinced many that my hugs and kisses approach would work much better. Many times when I got back to the barracks, my fellow GIs would joke because I would be scratched up from working with the exotic animals, and they would think I was out with a wild Fraulein and just use the animals as a cover-up. But believe me, it wasn't a cover-up. It was a lion or a tiger or bear, oh my. You know, my passion to experience every facet of animal training in Germany would lead me dangerously toward the verboten. For months, I had been hearing about some incredible trainers on the other side of the wall, the Berlin Wall in East Germany. However, because I was in the military, holding the highest possible clearance, a top secret crypto clearance with the US government, I was not allowed in any way, shape, or form to cross the border and go to East Germany. In fact, I hope the statute of limitations is over because I did find a way through my animal friends to get across the border to East Berlin and meet with some amazing people. I remember they gave me a paper saying that I was a school teacher and I was able to cross over for an introduction to a renowned trainer, a guy who specialized in Schützen training. It was just incredible to watch his dogs and his approach. I initially thought of his training as being negative, but the rapport this man Max had with his dogs was absolutely amazing. I learned an awful lot in the 4 or 5 hours I spent with him. For instance, the concept that if you have a dog that doesn't want to jump a fence, teach it to retrieve a ball. If you have a dog that doesn't want to retrieve a ball, teach it to jump a fence. Basically, you take what the dog's natural instinct is, then use it to gain ultimately what you want. Don't try to teach a dog something it doesn't want to learn because it's never really going to be super at it and never go to enjoy doing it. And remember, if you enjoy doing something, you're always going to get a good response. And that holds true for animals. So it was an incredibly few hours that I spent in East Germany, but the whole time I was there, I kept looking over my shoulder and thinking, if I get caught, God, am I in trouble? Will I spend time in East Germany jail, or will the West German government take me and put me in their prison? Well, they court-martialed me as a spy or something else. It was a scary time, but I did make it back to West Germany undetected and continued with my military service. You know, like every kid in the service, I love getting mail. But boy, did I hate writing. I had too many important things to do, too many women, too many guest houses, two to go. So I really didn't write much at all, but 6,000 miles, only enhanced by my mother's power to wield the Jewish guilt with letters like this. Dearest Stinker Warren, it's not enough that I hear from you so rarely. I have to contend with Grandma's big mouth saying you don't have her, you don't love her. God, what's happening? Let's hear it, bub. I don't know too many of your friends from the fire department, but strange faces keep popping over to me, ask how you're doing. Of course, I don't tell them I don't have the slightest idea. I did study drama in high school. Almost a year ago since you left for the Air Force, it seems like 10 years. Be good, be careful, call and write, all my love, mother, encloses a stamp, stationery, and money. Whenever my mother signed anything mother, I knew I was in trouble. I did get to extend my stay in Germany and continue my studies with the animals for a couple of weeks. I was working in this really remote area in Germany. It was called Barnemace Army Airfield, and to this day I still have no idea what they did there. Small planes would fly in and out with some big generals aboard and some big officers, and we were there to protect the planes. Anyway, I wasn't one to go downtown much, so the guys would always bug me. Come on, Eckstein, we'll have a few Steinhagers and maybe meet a couple of Frauleins. Finally, they convinced me, and we headed downtown. I remember walking into a bar and having these beautiful ladies sitting next to me, asking me to buy them a drink. Boy, was I impressed, not realizing at the time that the cognac and Coke I was paying for was nothing but plain Coke, costing me $5 or $6 a drink. Anyway, it didn't take me long to catch on to what was going on here. I think I was six to 8 months later. Just joking. The bar was right out of a John Wayne movie. I walked in there with some GIs from all over the United States, and on the jukebox, and I think in every jukebox in every military area, they had the Battle Hymn of the Republic and Dixie. When they played the Battle Hymn of the Republic, all the Northerners would stand up. When they played Dixie, all the Southerners would stand up. It was the Civil War deja vu. I remember fights breaking out with chairs and bottles flying. There were rough and tumble barroom brawls out of a Wild West movie. One time, something broke over my face. Broke over my face, and I woke up the next morning. I looked like a monkey. I was so swollen. A few stitches later, though, and I was back on my feet. Anyway, the black eye, the stitches, and the swollen lip did not discourage me from going back the next night. I met a lady there, Ursula, or Ushi, as I became later. We became really friendly. Obviously, there was an attraction, just enough for me to overlook that she was, how can I put it, a bar girl, hooker. In saner moments, a jealous person like me would not even dream of getting caught up in this situation. However, at this point, my mind was so out of focus that it didn't bother me. So I started dating this West German hooker who, by the way, had been married twice to 2 other American GIs in the United States and divorced twice, and was now living in Germany. She was an older woman, 12 years my senior, and it became a fantasy setup. I spent a lot of time off base hanging out at her very expensive apartment in downtown Frankfurt. She bought a brand new BMW and gave me the key so I could drive it around wherever I wanted to go. And was a great escape from the stifling reality of this service. While I was with her, I adopted a stray dog. What a shock, right? A little puppy that couldn't have been more than the size of my fist. I named him Cappy, and he became my European dog. When I was sent to the other places, and finally when I had to return to the States for good, I had to leave the dog with her. It was devastating to me. I mean, that I was really going to miss him, the dog, that is. Needless to say, my Jewish mother, back on Long Island, was not thrilled about my relationship with Ushi. One time I remember getting on the phone wherever I was and saying to her, "Ma, I think I'm going to get married." And she shouted to my dad, "Charlie, get me tickets for Pan Am. I'm going to Germany right now." When it was time for me to decide whether I wanted to stay in the service or leave, my wandering mind and spirit needed only 15 seconds to decide it was time to move on, and so I did. From Europe, I was sent to Langley Air Force Base in Virginia, where I spent about 5 or 6 months before being discharged. While at Langley, I decided to buy a car, and my mom lent me $500 or $600 to buy a brand new 1970 Duster 340, which I still owned up until a few years ago. The original bill of sale was in the glove compartment, and I started driving back to Oceanside every weekend from Virginia, exhilarated by almost having my freedom, as well as by the magnificent scenery along the route through the towns of Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. Because it was a hot car, my Duster tended to overlook posted speed signs, and one time when I was driving myself and some buddies through Delaware, we were pulled over by a Delaware state trooper. He took us to the courthouse where we had to appear before a magistrate, or whatever they call them there, who levied a $100 fine. Among the 3 of us in the car, we had maybe 75 cents combined. So here we were, 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. We had to be back at base at 6. We had been threatened with jail because we had no money. When the first sergeant at the base was called at this ridiculous time in the morning, he guaranteed the magistrate that on our next paycheck, he would get his money, which he did. It wasn't an isolated incident, by the way, because of my hot car and quick temper, I had a tendency to get into a lot of tickets. Yeah, I got a lot of tickets. As a matter of fact, there was a time when I went before a judge in Hampton, Virginia, who asked me when I was being discharged from the service. I said 2 weeks. That's exactly what I answered. His exact words to me were, "If I were you, son, I wouldn't be coming back to Virginia for quite a while." I just had so many speeding tickets. I wasn't a reckless person, but I think at the time my life was going fast that my car just followed. It was probably good that for many weekends I couldn't afford to buy gas. So even with the car, I had to hitchhike between Langley Air Force Base in Virginia and New York. Some of the experience I encountered while hitching were absolutely amazing. During my last days in the service, I sank into a deep depression. I can't exactly pinpoint the cause, but I felt very lonely. I know I didn't belong back on Long Island, going back to the lifestyle I had before enlisting in the service, yet I didn't know where to go or what to do. I have to admit that at this time my life was at a very low ebb. I can't say I was at the point where I was contemplating suicide, but I was drifting. I had no direction and zero focus. I remember doing a lot of walking, specifically in a place called Buckaroo Beach, which was kind of ironic because when I was a kid, my father used to tell me stories of Buckaroo Beach, and he was also stationed at Langley Air Force Base when he was in the military. After spending a couple of weeks at the barracks at Langley, a couple of GIs and myself decided to rent a bungalow at Buckaroo Beach. While walking along the jetty that would break the waves right along the beach, I contemplated a final jump into Chesapeake Bay. I mustered up the faith I had never called on before and appealed to myself. Okay, get on with it, your life. Go. Things are going to turn good. Focus on what you love. More than anything else in the world, animals. That's what I focused on.